The definition of class has always been a nebulous concept. In recent political campaigns, candidates have conveniently fueled class differences, with some intellectuals claiming that the distinction between classes is either polarizing or fading away. We discuss the middle class versus working class today on The Professors.
From across the city and the 7 city colleges of Chicago, broadcasting from 63rd and Halsted at Kennedy King College, The Professors, taking the art of conversation to a higher degree.
Before we start our conversation, let's take a look at the student-produced video on this subject.
My life one time was doing real good, and then I went from good to nothing. And I know that can happen to me. And my biggest fear is that happening to me again.
27-year-old Dana Williams was homeless for 3 years. She currently lives at Deborah's Place on the city's west side, which has been providing housing exclusively for homeless women since 1985. There she has access to a computer, can check out books from the library, or take part in exercise classes. Dana ended up homeless despite having a job.
I was a waitress, making $3 an hour plus tips. Some days tips wasn't great. Some days tips were great, but it wasn't enough tips to meet up for rent and bills and things like that.
During the cold winter months, Dana slept in hallways or cars, often with no heat or food.
I was just praying every day, staying strong. I get up every morning, look for a job.
Dana now works as a grill cook and she loves her job. She makes $11.45 an hour. She would be classified as working poor, a growing class of people in the Chicago area who are often just a paycheck away from being homeless.
If you think about homelessness as simply not having your own home and couch surfing or staying with family or doubling up, there are a lot of people who really are housing insecure who are working every day.
The Chicago Jobs Council works with several nonprofit groups, civic organizations, and businesses across the city to help people like Dana find jobs. Dana falls well below the self-sufficiency standard, which for a family of 3 in the Chicago area is currently about $56,000 a year. She would have to be making at least $30 an hour to cross over that line to be considered middle class. But the definition of middle class is more than just about how much a person makes. It's also about security.
So security in terms of your employment, is it full-time employment? Is it full-year employment? Is it employment that comes with some kind of benefits that if there's any injury or you have any health care need, you're going to be able to take care of that without having to go into your pocket or go into your bank account?
Middle class also means being able to help your children get an education and save for retirement. But the middle class has been shrinking in the recent years. Reliable industries such as manufacturing and construction have cut back their workforces, forcing many people to take lower-paying jobs. As a result, 30% of the working families in Illinois now fall below twice the federal measure of poverty. Dana is one example, but at least she has a job she feels good about.
It's what I like to do. It's what I love to do. I love feeding people. I love seeing people happy with their meal.
We often forget what a critical part of our lives our work is, and that really is how people identify themselves and think about their value, and it's a whole social part of their life.
Reporting for The Professors on WYCC PBS Chicago, I'm Cameron Frazier.
Joining us today are Professors Nick Pano-Mitros from Kennedy King College, Harper, and UIC, Akbar Dima from Chicago State University, Connie Mixon from Elmhurst College, and Carrie Thomas, Associate Director of the Chicago Jobs Council. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, so let's start with defining middle class versus working class. It's just a monster when we try to define it. Anyone want to take a stab at it?
Yeah, let me take a shot.
Okay.
The definition of middle class and working class is somehow blurred by many factors, and is nuanced, taking into consideration disciplinary context in which these issues are discussed. But I want to start by stating that the reason why we call middle class and we call working class and upper class is dates back to a certain history in England, whereby There were persons who worked in the rural areas, and those persons worked in the rural areas on the land that was acquired by the nobility who were not in the rural areas, and they worked on. And then when the industries came in the towns, the rural dwellers moved to the cities and worked in textile industries and became wage earners. So the wage earners in the city were an intermediate group between the nobility and the peasantry in the rural areas. That's why they were called middle class. As this segment of society grew, industrial societies in general had a large group of people who were classified as middle class in terms of their income. But now we have a situation where even the people who are called working class have wage earnings that are significantly higher than they were in the past. So in the 1980s, we used to refer to those as bourgeoisie working class. And you can see the confusion in terms right there. But I will pause.
What did you call them?
Bourgeoisie working class.
You know, we don't have the official caste system that other countries have had, but within the United States, there's a significant amount of social and economic stratification. And what's interesting to me is that everybody calls themselves middle class. Whether they're rich, whether they're poor, everybody just says, I'm middle class. Everybody's lumped into the middle class.
Do you think currently, given the economy, that folks are saying it still? Are we still saying that? Because I have friends who are highly educated and they're not feeling as if they are a part of the middle class.
Not quite. In the past, 80% of Americans consider themselves middle class. In the 2010 survey by ABC, 2010 survey by ABC, only 45%, as opposed to 80% consider themselves as middle class.
And is that because the gauges, the traditional gauges that we've used in the past to determine middle class, such as income, wealth and occupation and education, those things are not safety nets anymore? Do you, Carrie?
I think that when people identify themselves as middle class, what they're really speaking from is a sense of security, a sense of economic security. So whatever the reason is that is making people feel insecure, whether it's job loss or loss of the value of their home, or the fact that they can't save money anymore for their retirement, or their cost of education for their kids is going up, whatever it is that makes them feel insecure, I think is what brings the numbers down in that poll, which is people feel like middle class makes me feel like I'm secure, I can get the basics, and I can do relatively well, and I'm a typical American.
Well, you know what, I mean, in the past, education was usually a heavy key or tool to success. And so, you know, you gauge it by your education. It was a safe way that if you had a master's degree back in the 50s or even a college degree, that you would be better than middle class probably. And nowadays you have people with PhDs who don't have a job or are not in a bracket to even call themselves middle class, as we know. So I think that things have changed a lot with using prestige education as a marker.
But sociologists still do that. They look at occupational prestige, and when they look at occupational prestige, they would classify a professor in the upper class. Even though our incomes may not reflect that we would still be classified in the upper class, but you may have an electrician or a plumber who would be classified as working class, who's actually making more than the college professor.
Yeah. So has the definition changed then? In other words, you know, rather than emphasizing the education, we emphasize now just the money alone?
Well, class is about a whole bunch of things.
Because it seems as though that's changed.
It's not just income. It's not just wealth. It's also occupation. It's social status. It's educational levels.
And I think right now the conversation is focused on income because we're seeing indicators that there's erosion in the middle class by income, that there's increased economic you know, stratification, that there's increases in poverty. So there's a lot of things that are going on in income that are really calling that into question. But I also think there's a lot going on in the labor market. There's quite a bit of fluidity about skill demands and education demands. So then you see people who are highly educated and that's not paying off the way it used to. And you're seeing jobs that people once considered working class jobs that you just needed a high school education for, but those industries are shifting so much that they're really skilled positions. They really are similarly knowledge-based jobs.
So we should take it that income is only just one of the factors to be considered. In a more nuanced way of discussing this, even in the context of education, you find that there is a difference between someone who is considered a middle-class person and a working-class person, in the sense that the working-class person is not expected to utilize much of abstract thought in their own thinking processes, as opposed to a middle-class person who is educated and is in the professions. So you look at culture, you look at occupation, as Connie has correctly pointed out, you look at other factors, the way they consume their products. Do they come back from home with a six-pack and cigarettes when they get home, or do they come home with a newspaper and a cup of coffee? All of those factor into classification of middle class, the way we consume products, the way we think about society in general, the way we act.
Okay, so that's a good point that you brought up. Let's look at some numbers, which I'm sure we all are familiar with. In Illinois, currently we're about at 9.1 in terms of unemployment throughout the state. That's the average, the number. Compared to nationally, we're about at 8.2. With blacks, that's 14%. Hispanics, it's about 10.3%, and with teens, it's 25%. And I know most of us are educators, so we hear the teens who are struggling.
It can be 3 or 4 times higher than that in some inner city neighborhoods.
In terms of, right.
In terms of unemployment, yes.
So then let's look at some barriers. Carrie, let's talk about some barriers. We had talked about age discrimination, and that crosses gender and color lines.
That's right, and I think there's a lot of, given the high unemployment and then the shifts in different industries in this most recent recession, you're seeing impacts, the disadvantaged workers, or the people who are struggling the most. The characteristics of that group is really quite diverse. So you're seeing a lot of people who experienced good job security, lost their job, and now, honestly, they're facing age discrimination. So we're seeing an increase in age discrimination. Then we're seeing a lot of young people who aren't even being given the chance because experience is going to matter. We're seeing some companies advertise for jobs and saying only people who are currently employed need to apply. So we're seeing these dynamics in the labor market that a lot of people are really struggling with, and people who never thought they'd struggle. So people never thought they'd have to ask for help, whether it was from their neighbors or from the government. People who never thought they'd have to go back to school. People who never thought they'd have to get new skills. So there's a lot of things, there's a lot of dynamics in the labor market that are masked by just looking at the unemployment rate or just looking at a job growth number.
Is it legal to say that in order to apply for a position you have to be currently working? I don't know about that. But
well, they're actually, there's actually organizations that are suing over this. There's actually been legislation that's been proposed in Congress to make it clear that it's not. But it actually is happening on online job boards.
That seems to me to be a form of disparate treatment of potential applicants.
Well, at least in those cases, well, I say at least, folks are being frank with potential employees versus you go into an interview, and if you appear to be a certain age, or if you have dates listed and an employer, a potential employer gauges your age, then you are still discriminated against without knowing.
If they say it, but
right.
if you don't
know. Right. So it's happening all the time.
The other person is just better
qualified,
qualified, something.
And there's a lot of assumptions.
The right to work states.
There's a lot of assumptions about age too. So there's a lot of, it's easier for some employers right now because there's so many people looking for work to just make an assumption that based on your age or based on an industry that you came from, that you don't have certain technical skills or you don't have certain communication skills. And those are probably false assumptions in many cases.
So let's look at the American dream. We talked a little bit about that earlier.
Can I say something before we move on? You were talking about numbers of the people unemployed in the state of
nationally
Illinois.
And the state.
Yes, and then you were talking about possible impediments or barriers to their employment. especially of the young people, I think it needs to be pointed out quite clearly that there are jobs out there to be obtained, but the skills to match what the employers are looking for are not there. If we take a look at Craigslist, for instance, you find tons and tons of jobs there. But then the people who are seeking these positions do not have the skills that the employers are looking for. So I think that President Obama's emphasis on training for skills in the community colleges is a very excellent policy that needs to be pursued quite vigorously, because that is where these people, the young people, the inexperienced, are likely to get jobs.
So what about the students who are, they're students, they're basically full-time students looking for part-time work, and they are trying to find work. So there are lots of barriers for them. I have a student who transferred from a 4-year program to Kennedy King College due to money challenges, and she can't even find a job at McDonald's. I have known her for about 2 years, and she literally has looked for the last year for a job. And she is professional as can be for her age, I assume, I believe. I mentor her, so I think she's fairly okay in that area, but it's just, it's so competitive. And the teens, it's not...
College graduates are facing the highest levels of unemployment in history. And so those that do obtain an associate's degree or a 4-year degree or even a master's or beyond are having a lot of difficulty obtaining employment.
So Nick, let's talk about the American dream then. Do we need to revisit the American dream?
I think we look at the American dream, and it's not the same American dream it was 2 generations ago. When my parents came here, both as immigrants, the thing that they emphasized when I was growing up and my brother was that you go to school, get an education, and that's going to be your ticket to success. And nowadays, I see so many students graduate from school, and it's not enough. It's not enough that you just graduate from a university, even get a master's degree, even a PhD. You have to be more clever than that to get a job, because the supply-demand ratio for jobs and people available is totally in imbalance right now.
Well, let me ask you this, Connie, then, and anyone, if you can chime in.
Okay.
Why is examining the middle class versus working class folks, why is that an important examination?
Well, you saw the middle class open up in the 1950s. The GIs were returning from World War II, and it was widely available to a larger segment of society than it had been previously available to. But that was the point at which folks could have a good manufacturing type job with benefits. You maybe had one of the parents working, the other parent stayed at home, and you could support a middle class lifestyle. You had 2 cars, you had a house in the suburbs. But it's a much larger picture than that. It's the whole process of globalization that's happening throughout the world. And what that has resulted in, and it's particularly impacting urban areas, is a 2-tiered economy. The manufacturing jobs are gone, and we've shifted to a service manufacturing economy. And within that economy, there's really 2 tiers. There's those that are at the top of the tier, your attorneys, your traders, your accountants, and then you have the service workers, your retail workers, your restaurant workers at the bottom. And the middle class is shrinking at this point. As a result, there's fewer and fewer middle class, even though our politicians would, claim that they're addressing the middle class on a regular basis.
And the way that it used to be that you got into some of those higher paid, higher skilled jobs was you went to college and maybe you got a master's degree. But now you have to make sure you have the networks. You have all the right connections to other people, that you're mentored by people along the way, that you do internships, that you really can market yourself to get into those networks. And it also really does matter where you begin. So if your parents are in those networks, it makes a difference. If people in your neighborhood or your church or your summer programs, you meet other kids, that really helps you get into those networks. And so I think that stratification is really more pronounced, and things change more quickly. So you can't just depend on the college degree that you got for 10 or 20 years.
But you have to say that overall things are better than what they were in the past. I mean, a lot of people say this currently is like the Great Depression, but you don't see people in lines and sitting in the street with dirty clothes. I mean, there's a lot of assistance. Things are getting you do, but things are a lot better than what they were, say, in the 30s and the 20s. I mean, I think you have Medicaid, Medicare programs. Back then you didn't have those. You have organizations that help, like your organization. Back in the day you had nothing. So we're going in a better direction. Right now we're in a very hard time. And the thing is, what can we do to make this time even better than it is?
You know, going back to
It's not utopia. We're not in utopia right now.
Fair. So then what you're saying then, Nick, is it's not as tough as the first depression. Is that, and that's interesting
It's
that
not good enough.
Right, but it's
But
not
I'm
as
saying
tough.
let's
And
be
I think
optimistic that it can get better.
a lot of people don't even consider that, which is a good point that you made, because a lot of us weren't here during the,
Right.
I think none of us
Well,
were
I think
here, right?
going back to what
First
Carrie had
depression.
said earlier, I think that comes to how we think as Americans. You know, we're really big on equality of opportunity, not necessarily equality of outcomes. But we have to remember that we all don't start at the same place.
Okay.
And that's one of the things, particularly looking at housing opportunities that opened up during the 1950s. Who benefited from that? 98% of federal money that was poured into the housing industry went to whites. And so then that turns into generational wealth that is passed from generation to generation. African Americans, other minorities weren't able to benefit from those same opportunities of being able to purchase a low interest, no down payment home out in the suburbs. So they then are stuck in the poor areas, the ghettos of the city, and they aren't able to transfer that wealth to their children. And so we aren't all starting at the same place, and we don't think about that. We just say, well, why didn't your father work hard then? Or why don't you work harder?
And when you're stuck in a certain class, a middle class or lower middle income class, it's very hard to get out. I mean, education is such a big impediment, trying to get tuition paid. I mean, if you want to fix the system, make schools free, you know, or go with a voucher system at least, where you still have private schools, but you can go wherever you want, and you know, let everybody have.
Well, a K-12 system is the common schools.
I think a lot of countries have it where the universities are also free, and you can get a hybrid here where you still have private schools. The government takes care of that because we all have the same tools in our box: education and free access to health care. Because I can't help that I need more health care. You know, I have more health care needs than you, and automatically I'm at a disadvantage. You put those two things together, and you'll have true capitalism.
If I may interject you, Americans reject socialism.
But it's not socialism.
No. I'm just talking about this in very light-hearted terms. When you ask for schools to be free,
We're talking about
they will
colleges, right?
Yes, they will accuse you of implementing socialism, which they have accused Obama about, and many other elements in the Congress. So, but I understand what you mean. Let me go back to the point you made earlier about these programs that are designed to help people who are poor and get them out of poverty. You know that these progressive programs are under serious threat, and they have to be reformed, otherwise they will no longer be there because there is not the resource base to support them. And I'm talking about Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security.
And there are timelines with welfare, right? In terms of money payouts, or right? So then after I have a
So these are the
You're
things.
saying no?
Oh no, I completely agree. There's other services for the most destitute that they're in tatters. They're not. I drove down Lakeshore Drive this morning at 6:30 this morning and saw on the north side, half a dozen people sleeping, 45 degrees, sleeping right outside of Lakeshore Drive. So I think we don't know the impact of this recession, and I think we don't really know what's going to happen. I'm not saying that people are going to be lining up and it's going to look like the 30s, but I do think we're really not out of it, and to see how well our safety net is protecting people.
So if we look at these things in these terms, you know that the American dream, as we understand and understood it, has eroded over time, and it's not going to be easy to get things back to where they were, where you have one person working in the family and the other person staying home and taking care of the children. Now we have two people working in one family, and it's difficult to make ends meet.
And so let's talk about the Occupy movement nationally. I believe we have another one in Chicago coming up in May. I read somewhere a major one coming up in early May.
With the NATO summit.
No, a separate, just a separate Occupy movement.
Okay.
At least that's what I read. So what's been the benefit in terms of, or benefits in terms of the Occupy movement? Are the 99ers being heard truly by those who need to hear us?
I think they're being heard. I think they're being heard. I think it's another version of a message from people who really care about there being more equality across income scales, and people who are concerned about the social supports that exist for any of us potentially. I think it's part of a lot of messages that are out there. You know, a lot of things that are.
Yeah, I think it's a very good response to the rightist elements in the Tea Party. The Occupy movement speaks to a lot of the things that the Tea Party people cannot understand. One of the things they have highlighted quite clearly is the need for all of us to understand that there is corporate greed that affects all of us, including the Tea Partiers and everybody. And if we can curb that, we can address some of the issues in the nation.
You know what's interesting about that? You know, you can think of it as being two sides of the same coin, almost, the Tea Party and the Occupy movement. But what I find interesting with a lot of the rhetoric coming from both sides, but particularly from the Tea Party side, is, you know, this whole anti-government kind of stuff. When you actually look at who they are, they're receiving huge governmental services, like Medicare, for example.
Absolutely.
They're dependent upon Medicare, Social Security, but yet they want government out of their life, but not their programs.
I think I think one thing I'd like to go back to is this
And then
idea
we'll have final
that
thoughts.
this idea that it is different now, and I do agree that it is. You know, what it isn't like it is in the 30s, but we have very different expectations about what success looks like now and what it should look like. So I do think there's a little bit of lack of clarity still about, you know, what it means to be successful economically or in our society, and that's where some of the disagreement and concern and, you know, rhetoric comes from.
Okay. You want those to be your final thoughts?
That will be my final
Okay,
thoughts.
cool. Thanks.
Okay, I think that the middle class and the working class are going to face serious challenges in today's economic arrangements unless somehow they can aggregate their interests, come together as a coalition, and challenge the powers that be to cut them a fair slice of the pie.
Okay. I think we as a society are significantly impacted by the forces of globalization. And I think that we have to think about what kind of country, and we can start here in the city of Chicago. What kind of city do we want to be? Do we want to be, you know, we're going to be a global city regardless, but do we want to be one that has huge disparities in wealth, or do we want to be a city that's fair and humane?
Okay.
I think that we can't lose sight of the American dream, that the American dream is something that's fluid and changes, and we have to have optimism. This kind of discourse is so important, and we have to make sure that we make the proper change so that in the future we can still have that dream available for our children and generations to come.
All right. Well, thank you all. Appreciate it. Thank you for joining us. See you next time on The Professors.
Thank you.
you.
Thank you.